Welcome to the Birth Lounge podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts, support your mental health, and learn the tips and tricks that thousands of parents have used to craft their ideal birth. We will answer all of your questions, the scary ones and the weird ones, to help calm your fears and feel confident going into your birth. I'm going to help you redefine what birth and motherhood looks like and how to embrace your journey. I've intentionally crafted a list of experts to help you navigate pregnancy, explore your birth options, and plan for postpartum so that it can be a time of soaking in your tiny human. We're going to go there on all the hard topics so that you can dive deep into finding your confidence and freeing yourself from fears around birth. With over 10 years of experience in family education and a master's degree in human development and family studies, I created this podcast as a way to share the resources parents need to make educated and informed decisions about their care in pregnancy and childbirth. This is a birth community driven by evidence-based information and research in hopes to help you explore your options, understand your rights, and know what choices you have along the way when it comes to birth and beyond. I'm your host, HeHe. Now let's get to the good stuff. Ashe, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Heck yeah, I'm so excited to dive into this conversation. Before we got started recording, I was telling you that I have expanded from pregnancy and birth related topics to two topics that are adjacent, and fertility being one of them. This hub, this one-stop shop that women and their families can turn to get evidence-based information and to get really scientific things and situations and diagnosis and just health conditions explained to us, health options even, explained to us in a way that is easy to understand, that breaks it down to where we all know what's going on with our bodies. We understand what our options are, and we know how to have these conversations with our providers. So I'm stoked to have you on today to talk about egg quality. I'm very interested in breaking down fertility in every single piece so that we can understand how our whole system works together. We obviously all know that an egg and a sperm are important, but I think very few people actually understand why they're important, what makes a good quality egg and sperm, how those two things are then going to meet up and interact with one another. Today, let's dive straight into defining what egg quality is, and then we kind of jump from there on what we need to know, what we can do to improve it, what makes egg quality bad, different conditions that you might get diagnosed with, and options that you have there.
Okay.
Cool. So do you mind just defining what egg quality is in terms of our conversation today? What will we be thinking about when we hear the term egg quality?
Yes. So, as we might dive into a little later, I have some thoughts around egg quality that I will share. In particular, I think that it is a term that is somewhat outdated that we could definitely expand on and understand a little bit more thoroughly so that we really can support our fertility in a more efficient and robust way. But in general, the general understanding or the general definition of egg quality, so to speak, is I guess you can boil it down to the quality of the egg, right? We need an egg. So how healthy, how defined, how developed, how ready is that egg to be ovulated, and is that egg prepared enough for fertilization? Does it have all the ingredients and everything that it needs in order to be fertilized properly, to turn into an embryo, to then turn into your baby, right? So we're looking at the quality of the egg, which there are a lot of different factors that really come into understanding what influences the quality of an egg, which a lot of us think that what we do on a day-to-day basis, what we're eating, our lifestyle, these are things that we're told by our doctors. We read them in books too, that these influences in our life can impact our egg quality. And the idea of that is that, okay, yes, we want to think about having good quality eggs because we want to have a healthy baby, right? But like I was saying before, I think it's a little bit of an outdated understanding because there really isn't a whole lot of solid research out there that defines our nutritional and habitual influence on influencing the egg quality itself. And that is primarily because most of our eggs are about 90% already developed before you're even born. With that, we have to expand the conversation and understand that our eggs are already mostly developed for the entire time that we are alive in the womb and through puberty, and then all the way until we hit menopause and we stop ovulating. And so there's a couple of different phases of egg development, which we call oogenesis or oogenesis. Different people pronounce it different ways. Tomato. But there's this process of meiosis that occurs. And the first stage occurs within gestation, and the second stage occurs within each and every ovulatory cycle. And there are a few things that can influence that process, but this really boils down to the body's ability to divide its cells and less on the quality of its egg, of the egg itself, which is mostly defined when it's being fully developed in gestation. So with that, I think the general consensus around egg quality is really pure in coming to understand that we want to improve that to be able to support our fertility and our ability to have a healthy baby. But there's really more to the science that we have to understand, and where it goes beyond just the egg itself of what we're wanting to support in order to really get the fertility outcomes that we're looking for. So I hope that kind of clears up what we think egg quality is versus what egg quality actually is. And I think we can take it from there if you want to explain what are those other influences and why is it not the egg itself that we should be focusing on.
Yes, I do want to go there. I also have so many other questions. My mind is blown because I knew obviously that all of our eggs were already what they were at birth. I knew that already. That makes sense. I've never connected it to obviously they're already there. Now I have questions about those things that we're told to do, but yeah, let's start with what those other influences are, and then we can circle back to the questions that I have. I will write them down so that we can circle back.
Okay. So one of the things that we have to consider is that if we want to speak a little bit to oogenesis, which is the development of oocytes, which is the fancy word for egg, right? Most of this happens about 2 weeks post-conception. So like I said, then they get stalled, they develop a little bit, but then that development stalls up until puberty. And then what these eggs are doing and what they're stalled in their own little cocoon for a while. And these cocoons are called our follicles or our primordial follicles. So we hear about ovarian follicles, right? And we want to think about follicle count. We want to think about that sort of stuff. We look into AMH if we're looking at IVF or those kinds of therapies. And we're considering this follicle count. When you get more into fertility, you hear more about follicles than you do more about eggs. And this is why, because those eggs, they rest in their primordial follicles, which are underdeveloped follicles up until puberty. And then once puberty happens, these follicles, which you can have up to, I think it's 500,000 to 1 million follicles with these underdeveloped eggs inside of them, resting in what we call the primordial follicle pool inside of your ovaries. You're not going to be able to see this because it's just so microscopic. You can't really see it until the follicles begin to develop and grow. And so with puberty, and then with each ovulatory cycle, these follicles begin to grow larger and they contain the egg, and the egg begins to divide and grow a little bit bigger alongside them. In which case, at the point of ovulation, you're able to actually see the egg. It's one of the only cells that you can see the egg under a microscope, or I think with the bare eye. I might be getting confused on that one, but you can see it. You can definitely see it. So I want to backtrack and say one of the things that we hear a lot about egg quality is that it takes about 90 days to support your egg quality. And I think that although, like I said, this is a pure thought, it's a little bit misconstrued because it's less about egg quality and it's more about follicle quality during that 90-day time period. So these follicles that are holding the eggs, the primordial follicles, they actually take about an entire year to go from primordial follicle all the way up to a pre-ovulatory follicle, which is the follicle that is going to contain the egg that will then ovulate during ovulation, right? Which is the egg that will then become fertilized and then turn into your baby. So we want to think about this whole time frame is super important. And it's one of the big reasons why in the functional health realm, we talk about working on your preconception health for up to a year prior to having your baby. But this is like a long process. I could point out 5 different stages that the follicles go through. And I don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of what they are, but they turn from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle, which are still quite small, but then they turn into a pre-antral follicle. They get blood supply and they get that response to FSH, which we may hear a little bit about in regard to fertility as well. If you have a low or high FSH, can have an influence. And then they go into antral development and then pre-ovulatory development. So this antral development and pre-ovulatory development is more so within that 14-day time frame of when your body is preparing for ovulation. We sometimes hear that as like the follicular phase. If you get into the menstrual cycle and the different phases of the menstrual cycle, there's that 14-day time frame. But it's really the pre-antral and the antral development that makes up the 90-day time frame, because the pre-antral follicles and the antral follicles, it's about 75 days for pre-antral, 14 days for the normal menstrual cycle. So that's about 90 days right there. And we think about this because, like I said, the pre-antrals are the ones that get access to the blood supply. So what's going to be coming to them through our blood is going to have an influence. So we want to think about different toxins. We want to think about inflammation. They're more susceptible at these stages. And we have to keep in mind that these follicles are the little cocoons that are protecting our eggs, right? They are, if those follicles become damaged, then those eggs are allowed to be exposed, which can have an influence on their quality to some degree, but it's less about the egg itself, and it's more about the follicle and its ability to protect that egg sufficiently enough. So this 90-day time frame is really important for, that's why you hear things like support your egg quality with your nutrition, make sure you're getting good nutrients, make sure you're decreasing exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, you're staying hydrated, you're doing all the things to try to support that egg quality. But really what you're supporting is that follicle quality. And although this may be a little bit nuanced, and some people might be like, what does it matter, right? Like, why does it matter if we're talking about follicle versus we're talking about egg? The follicles impact the eggs and the eggs are susceptible at that time. What is this nuance with terminology? And I'll tell you why. It's because the follicle is one of the most important factors in your ability to ovulate. Even if you have an egg, ovulation is not guaranteed. So if we know that during the menstrual cycle, we have that first 14 days, which is what we call the follicular phase. It can be broken into the follicular phase and the ovulatory phase. It's that time where your brain hormones are communicating to your ovaries. Your ovaries are producing estrogen. They're producing testosterone. They're getting the body ready to ovulate. And at this time, you have about, now, I would say from like the beginning, you have, remember how I said that there were about 500,000 to 1 million eggs in the beginning? With that primordial, the follicles in the very beginning that we're taking, that I said takes like the first step of it, about 100 to 900 are recruited. This whole process in the end, there are about 5 to 7 that are actually recruited in the very, very end. But in the end, we only get 1 that then ovulates. So these hormones that are being produced during this time, the ability for those follicles to respond properly is going to determine whether or not those follicles are going to ovulate the eggs that they contain. And so we tend to see if there are some metabolic issues, if there are some other influences, we may see follicles develop, but they don't actually develop into that pre-ovulatory follicle. And we may get anovulation. We see this a lot with PCOS. And then we see that we have those little cysts that form because the follicles are developing, but they're not developing properly. And then in the end, we want to have that pre-ovulatory follicle that is then recruited. So out of 100 to 900, depending on your age, we have that one that is recruited. And that follicle of that one is so important because the egg, all it's going to do is it's going to divide. It's going to go through the meiosis process. It's going to divide and it's going to do what it needs to do. Like I said, it's already about 90% matured. It's just waiting on the follicle to allow it to do what it needs to do. But if the follicle isn't developed properly or doesn't have the right ingredients itself, its cell wall might not open properly. It might not allow the egg out of the follicle to be able to be ovulated. That's one situation that we could potentially see. Again, that might be related to cysts too. It's a different conversation, but we can see that like follicles are important for ovulation. Yes. But after ovulation occurs, let's say the egg actually does get out of the follicle, all right, and goes on to ovulate and hopefully gets fertilized if that's what you're looking for, or doesn't, depending. Let's say if we're looking to get pregnant, then we want that follicle after it releases the egg, after it ovulates, it's going to turn into this temporary endocrine gland we call the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum is going to produce progesterone. And if you don't have enough progesterone, that's a huge factor behind a lot of early term miscarriages, because it takes about that first trimester time frame for the placenta to take over in progesterone production. So prior to that, you're relying on that follicle to produce progesterone. So what I'm getting at with all of this is the egg's just hanging out and chilling. It's just doing what it's going to do. The follicle is doing the work. The follicle needs more attention. I think we need to give the follicles a little bit more credit in some of this conversation around fertility. And yeah, that 90-day time frame is important too, because speaking a little bit more to eggs in particular, remember how I said that they have to divide, like they're just hanging out and they're just dividing. I've mentioned that a little bit, like here and there. This division, this meiosis process, like I said, the first part happens in gestation. The second part happens right before, there's kind of two parts to the second part, but the first part happens right before ovulation and the second part happens at fertilization. But this division is so necessary for ensuring that we have the proper number of chromosomes. And so then we can get into chromosomal health, which a lot of miscarriages early term can be related to chromosomal insufficiency, or we may have an extra chromosome, we get Down syndrome or other types of chromosomal deformities. And so we also want to think about the division factor of these eggs, which a lot of that boils down to the egg's ability to produce energy. So going back to the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria, eggs have one of the most mitochondria out of all the cells in our body. And there's a reason for that. It's because of this process. And so that 90-day time frame, when we're thinking about the follicles that are trying to protect that egg, if they get susceptible or if they become exposed to inflammation and oxidation, that can damage their mitochondria and damage their ability to duplicate properly. And we may have chromosomal errors that can come through. So we see that, yeah, there is maybe some influence on the cells, the egg cell's ability to duplicate and to deliver its chromosomes. But a lot of it still boils down to the follicle being able to protect it or not. And then there's other things that can contribute to the DNA or the chromosomal delivery of the egg cell, which a lot of that kind of begins prior to conception and during prenatal health, when those eggs, those oocytes are being developed in the first place. So we want to be thinking about that like way before conception. And then we can also think about that time right before ovulation and how that may have an impact as well. So that kind of gives you like an overview of development of follicles. I can go a little bit further into what some things are that may impact follicle development further, or I can just pause and see if that is all making sense and soaking in. And if you have any questions about that process.
Yeah, I have a ton of questions. So let's hold on to the follicle health and we can circle back to that. I do want to say, isn't it the funniest thing ever that we all remember the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell? It is the
Yes.
funniest thing. Every single time I hear an adult go, the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, I'm like, that's hilarious that we all do that. That's so
It's
funny.
so true.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so I do have actually quite a number of questions. I think my first question is, when we're doing the things that we're told to do, the diet, the exercise, taking the vitamins, being hydrated, getting enough sleep, if it's not impacting egg quality per se, what is it doing for us? Are those the things that are impacting follicle health?
Yeah, essentially. So those are going to be things that are going to help support the follicles, as well as support your endocrine system and support. We have to break it all down back to the foundations to begin, right? Because I said, like, those follicles, they get access to the blood supply at that certain stage of development. And so, yes, what we're eating can have an influence on how much, if we're eating a lot of processed foods, if we're eating a lot of non-organic things that are just exposed to a lot of pesticides and herbicides, if we're if we're using toxic products in our home or whatnot, we may be exposing ourselves to endocrine disrupting chemicals, to things that can cause inflammation in our body. And that all may have an impact on that growth or development of those follicles, of course. And it's like nutrients are needed for every metabolic process in our body. And this is a metabolic process, so to speak. So all of that is important. But I was going to go off with something else, but I lost my train of thought there. But yes, those things can be really important for the development of the follicles at that time. But okay, this is what I was going to get at. It's pregnancy brain. Let's just throw that out there because I'm 34 weeks pregnant. But if we need to take it back a little bit, and we need to think about, like, those follicles, they grow in response to FSH, which is a hormone that comes from our brain, which is a part of the endocrine system. So we need to think about the endocrine system as a whole and how these lifestyle factors could be impacting our endocrine system. And then what impacts our endocrine system is our other foundations. So, like, our digestive system, our blood sugar regulation, our ability to detoxify properly, and all of that, or liver health, all of that plays a role into influencing the health and quality of our endocrine system. And you can see how it all trickles back down. So yes, it may have a direct impact to some degree, but it can also have this sort of like roundabout impact too, by affecting our digestion and our blood sugar. And it's like fertility, when we're speaking to it in this way, fertility is the essence of our overall health. When we're fertile, then our body is in a state of health and optimism and optimal health. And when we're having fertility struggles or fertility issues or ovulatory issues or hormonal based symptoms, a lot of that is related to dysfunction in certain areas of our body. So our bodies may need a little bit more support. And so if your body was having some of those struggles or having some of those metabolic issues, then that's a sign and a need for support, and in turn can impact your fertility. So I like to think of fertility as it's another sort of vital sign, so to speak. It's helping you to really understand what's going on in your body.
That's so interesting. I always have said the same thing about kind of your menstrual cycle. Like your menstrual cycle is another vital sign. The Fertility Friday brand talks about that as well. Just like your menstrual health and fertility as a woman, and then your fertility as a man. Obviously, they don't have menstrual cycles, but it's a good indicator of your health, and we should be paying attention to it. It's so crazy how that is not taught to us, right? That's not how we treat women's health. It's not how we treat our menstrual cycles. It's much more of a taboo topic, and it is bred as this thing to hide and almost be shameful of and don't talk about it. A lot of people will say, "Oh my gosh, it's gross and yucky." And actually it's a good pulse on how you are doing. So, have a couple of the questions about things that I get asked about a lot in terms of preparing egg quality, which now I'll correct people to the language of follicle quality or follicle health. But what about probiotics? Should we be adding a probiotic? And then, in addition to that, are there any other supplements that you should consider having?
So I'm going to preface this by saying that I never feel comfortable giving any sort of supplement recommendation without knowing the person individually. And that's just because different people can present with similar symptoms, different people can have fertility issues, but there could be varying degrees of underlying factors. And sometimes when it comes to supplementation, I really recommend working with a practitioner and getting as strategic as possible with it based on your situation, especially when we're speaking to fertility, because we want to make sure that we're not going to be, making something worse. A good example I could give for that would be like, I think one of the common supplements that gets thrown around a lot is Vitex, of like, oh, Vitex is going to support your eggs, it's going to support your follicles, it's going to support your progesterone, it'll support your fertility. And yes, in some people it might, but only in certain hormonal conditions. Whereas, for example, in women with PCOS who may have like higher LH levels, that could be contributing to that. Vitex might actually not be a good recommendation for those individuals and could perpetuate their issues. So I'm going to hold off on recommending any like specific herbs or supplements and that sort of thing, and really just hone in on working on your diet, working from like a north to south process of your digestion too, making sure, I think the best thing, like even if you're taking the highest quality supplements, if your digestion is not primed, is not optimal to begin with, you're basically just making really expensive pee and poop. You know what I mean? And like probiotics definitely can be helpful, but that's a nuanced topic as well, because different strains of probiotics can have different impacts and different influence on the body. And I don't think there's any harm really with taking like a general basic probiotic, but whether or not it's going to help somebody in particular in their fertility, I can't really say unless I know them and their situation. And in some cases, probiotics could make certain symptoms worse, especially if somebody has SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It may actually exacerbate their symptoms, and that could be a root cause of their inflammation that's triggering their ovulatory quality and infertility. So what I'm getting at is with supplements, I usually err on the side of caution and suggest that people work with a practitioner and better understanding which supplements are going to be appropriate for them. But there are certain things that you can do, and maybe like a couple of recommendations that I start with I'm going to play it safe and stay on the side of digestion to begin, because a lot of it, if you're not digesting your food properly, you're not getting your nutrients. If you don't have your nutrients, your metabolism isn't going to work properly. All these metabolic processes that we talked about aren't going to work properly. But working on slowing down and chewing your food properly, not being distracted when you're eating your meals. You can experiment. One thing that I would say might be pretty safe for certain people would be like apple cider vinegar diluted in the middle of your meal or at the end of your meal, which may help to support stomach acid production and support your body's ability to break down your food better. There's simple things that you can do that maybe wouldn't constitute like a huge supplement protocol per se. If you're getting into, I could technically sit here and talk with you about what supplements would be really good for certain situations. You know what I mean? Because if we want to talk about egg division and that meiosis process and mitochondrial health, things like CoQ10 could be supportive, but also so could like red light therapy. That may be something that is probably pretty benign and may support you just the same, if not better to some degree. like CoQ10 could be helpful, or different antioxidants, and you can get antioxidants through your food or vitamin C. And there's some basic things that are pretty benign for most people that you may be able to take, or like a good high quality prenatal, a good high quality multivitamin could be pretty safe for most people too. But again, there's just so many nuances. And I preface all of this by saying I work with practitioners. I'm very careful about recommending certain supplements because I've seen so many people try this and try that and throw spaghetti at the wall and see if this works and see if that works. And you wind up wasting a lot of money in the end. You have really expensive pee or poop. And we can get a whole lot more strategic with what we're using. And I think that can be one of the most supportive things rather than just trying this and trying that.
Yeah, not only that, but if you are in a time crunch, and not like a time crunch of, oh my God, we gotta have a baby, but if you've got a plan and you're like, I'd like to have a baby by this time, or maybe it's your age, or maybe it's the age of your last baby and you want them close in age. People have all sorts of reasons for timing pregnancies, but not only do you waste money, but you're wasting time. You could just get some tests and determine what's exactly needed for you. This is done by a blood test.
Yes and no. Like I have definitely recommended certain supplements to individuals that I've just met with and did a health history intake and had
Hmm.
a conversation with. If I can look at their food journal and see what maybe they're missing, I can understand their symptoms better. I can get a better picture of what maybe basic supplements I might recommend at that time. But these are going to be very surface level. Now, if I'm wanting to get into certain supplements that may more directly influence their hormonal or metabolic health. So, speaking to things like Vitex or DIM, we sometimes hear people talk about DIM with their estrogen, or looking at like myo-inositol for blood sugar. We see that recommended with PCOS a lot. If I'm going to get into more of those like specific herbs or even blends, because there are a lot of products that I'll work with that contain very specifically blended nutrients and botanicals that promote or support a certain area specifically. I may and usually do recommend some form of testing, but the way that I work with people, that I have worked with people, it's always very bio individual. I'm not a practitioner that's just going to say, take this or take that. I'm not in it to try to get supplement sales or commissions. I'm in it to try to make sure that people are taking what they actually need to be taking to support their body and their systems appropriately. But if we want to get a little bit more fine tuned, then yeah, blood work is a great option. It's something that I usually go for first because I really want to understand their metabolic and their cellular health to begin with. I want to understand how their body is responding to certain things, just what I'm seeing on that kind of basic level. But from that point, I may combine or take it a step further and order some more functional testing, like a Dutch test, which
Hmm.
is a dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. I may order a GI map test. There's a handful of different additional steps that you can take based on, and I usually have a conversation with someone first. I do their health history, have a conversation, maybe we do blood work, and then we jump into more of those functional testing to make sure that we're not, again, just throwing money away because these tests can also be quite expensive. But having testing is definitely one of the ways that we can get a whole lot more clear on what we're recommending. And we can also have that data point on how the certain supplements or interventions that we're providing are having an influence on them and what kind of progress they are making. But I will also say that there are other ways that we can assess progress. There are other ways that we may be able to understand their situation more thoroughly, such as menstrual cycle charting, tracking, understanding their menstruation, doing fertility awareness charting, even if it's not for charting for ovulation to try to get pregnant, but just to understand what's happening with their hormones. There's a lot of free things that we can do too that can help us to understand a person's situation better and help to guide them in a way that is going to provide them with more targeted and strategic recommendations, as well as recommendations that are going to fit their lifestyle. Because it's
Yeah.
hard to
Okay.
make changes.
Yeah, I want to hear more about the Dutch test and the GI maps. I got married 6 months ago, 7 months ago now. Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
maybe 8 months ago. Ah, we got married in October. And we obviously children are on everyone's mind. And so as we get closer to starting to think about that as well, I have started to do some of these tests. And I'm working with a functional medicine doctor, and we're doing a lot of what you're saying. So take us through the Dutch test and also that GI map so that you guys can know what test I'm doing. This will be fun. I haven't thought about talking about my own journey, but this will be great. So, Ash, what are those tests? I've already done a Dutch test. I did one back in 2018. And for me as a consumer, I thought it was amazing. I thought it was incredibly informative. It taught me so much about my body that I did not know. I did it because I had just swapped to fertility tracking. I just swapped to tracking my menstrual cycle, and I had taken away all pharmaceutical birth control. I swapped from tampons. I was to like period underwear. I was getting really aware and very intentional about my menstrual health. And I do feel like the last couple of years I've gotten so much healthier and so much more in tune with my body. And so now being in this next phase of things is very interesting. So, what are those two tests and what will they tell us?
sure. So the Dutch test stands for the dried urine test of comprehensive hormones. I really love this test. It is, as the name depicts, one of the most comprehensive tests for understanding hormone health on the market. It is very, there's a lot that goes on with it. If you've seen it, it is a complex test. There's a lot of dials, a lot of pathways, a lot of things. It's not like a blood test where you're just going to get, here's your quantitative value. One of the things that I love about the Dutch test is that you can see not only quantitative values of your hormones, so like where they are based on when you're taking it in your cycle, but you can really see the pattern of metabolism of those hormones. So you can see like where exactly those hormones are going, what they're doing in your body, which is important because hormone health is nuanced. It's not just about having the number, the right amount of a hormone, but it's like, what is your body actually doing with that hormone that we want to understand and know? So it's going to give you a good understanding of that metabolic process, how your body is metabolizing it, how it's clearing those hormones properly, as well as like where your hormones are at. Normally with the Dutch test, you take it in your luteal phase, so you take it after ovulation. So you can get a good sense of your progesterone, you can get a good sense of your estrogen at that time. But not only does it test for those steroid sex hormones, but it also goes into your adrenal health too, which is another really amazing aspect of the Dutch test because your adrenals are a huge part of your endocrine system. So we want to be looking at those too, because what can impact your adrenals can impact your sex hormone production, it impacts your ovaries, your thyroids, all the other endocrine glands within your thyroid, all the other endocrine glands within your body. And so you can see how well is your adrenal, how well are your adrenals operating? How well are they metabolizing things too? Are they producing sufficient cortisol? Is it underproducing cortisol? You can get a look at like your liver health with that too, just to see, is your liver able to metabolize this or that properly? It's really a robust test that gives you insight into your ovarian hormone production, your adrenal hormone production, your liver function, your hormone clearance. It can also give you insight on like your sleep quality and what's going on in that regard. There's a lot that goes on with it that I really enjoy using that test. But again, it's not the right test for everybody. Just because someone has hormonal issues or are worried about HPA dysfunction or something going on with their adrenals, it may be a good test, but it's not always the best test for everyone too. And I say this because although it can give us a good understanding of like quantitative values and the patterns and stuff, there are still always those underlying factors that can contribute to how those hormones and patterns are working and operating. You know what I mean? And then it's if you're not ovulating too, then I usually don't recommend a Dutch test to people because you're not going to be producing those hormones in the first place. So it's an individual test that I would recommend to some and not recommend to others. And it really just depends on the person. But if it is something that's good for a person, they are ovulating, if they're experiencing maybe some symptoms of estrogen dominance or estrogen excess, or they're having a lot of sleep quality issues, or they just don't feel right in all of that, then I may recommend a Dutch test. But otherwise, like there's a lot of stuff that you can figure out through blood work too, especially if you're not ovulating. And the reason I bring that up is because oftentimes with fertility related issues, not all the time, but there is a big portion of fertility related issues that kind of gets tracked back to anovulation. So the inability to ovulate properly, whether we have PCOS or whether we're amenorrheic, we're not getting a period, we're not ovulating, or we're just not ovulating as well as we would want to. We can test your hormones via blood with a cycle day 3 measure, and that can give us a ton of information as well. That's going to be completely different than the Dutch test. Whether or not I opt in for a cycle day 3 and blood work or a Dutch test really depends on the person and their situation, but both are really great options. The GI map is like, it's like a map of your GI system, your gastrointestinal system. It gives you a really good look at what is going on with the bacteria in your digestive tract. If there are any pathogens that you may need to consider, any bad bacteria, any dysbiotic bacteria, any protozoa, any parasites potentially. It's not going to give you, it's not the best for detecting parasites, for example, but it can be really good at detecting other things. It can also give you a good insight on your gut immunity and how that's functioning. And there's a lot of good information that you can get from a GI map if you are experiencing a handful of digestive related symptoms. So again, does everybody need a GI map? I think it really depends. It depends on your symptoms. It depends on if you are experiencing a lot of GI issues and we're suspecting that the digestive dysfunction or dysbiotic patterns could be having an influence on your inflammation levels or your liver function or your hormones later on down the road. And so when it comes to functional testing, it's so bio-individual, but it depends on the person. And each of these tests can be upward of $300 to $400. So instead of just going out there and purchasing it or doing it because you hear, oh, the Dutch test or, oh, the GI map is going to give you all the information you need, like I recommend working with the practitioner, having a conversation to begin figuring out where you should put your money intentionally so that you're getting the most accurate data for you and you can create the recommendations and get the lifestyle and the supplements and the things that are actually going to be supportive for you at the time and place of where you are.
So just individualized medicine, which is the goal.
Yeah.
That's perfect. And then you can see how easy it is. And the hospital system just won't do it. And it's so frustrating because it's literally so easy. Dive in a little bit more to that cycle day 3 measure. What are we looking for? It's a blood test. You go on day 3 of your menstrual cycle. Is that right? So 2 days after you start your period?
Yeah. So, yep, exactly. Since the first cycle day 1 would be the day that you start your period. And this is not considering spotting. I just want to emphasize that it's the full day of full blood flow. And so, day 1, you get your period, day 2, day 3. And you can take it between day 2 and 4 to get like similar measures, but we usually recommend day 3 as the most accurate. And it is a blood test, but it's not like just one blood test. It's just a series of markers that we would test during that time frame. I could rattle off a list of things. We've got, of course, FSH, LH. You can test your estradiol or other estrogens. You can test your DHEA. You can test prolactin. You can test AMH. You can test your androgens, testosterone, SHBG. Like there are a lot of different markers that may be a little bit nuanced to get into what these markers actually are, but they can be helpful to test at that point in time so we can get a better understanding of what we're leading into with the menstrual cycle, what's flowing over from the last cycle. And that can help us to better understand like what we're working with and what patterns we're seeing in that regard. I think a good example with this would be FSH and LH to just land on with like when you're looking at the ratios between FSH and LH might give us some insight on if you're perimenopausal, if there's like PCOS, if there's hypothalamic amenorrhea. And so looking at like those ratios and those patterns and the certain quantitative levels of FSH to LH can give us a good understanding of what may be contributing to anovulation. Same with prolactin. If your prolactin levels are really high, that could have an influence on ovulation as well. And like I said, you can test for your androgens, your estrogen. Testing progesterone is not necessary during that time because you don't have it at the levels that you need it. You want to test progesterone in the luteal phase. But if you have really high levels of estrogen when they're not supposed to be super high, that's a good indication that there could be something going on. Androgens too. I don't want to get into too much of the nuance, but like sometimes when you're doing a Dutch test, your testosterone level is inaccurate due to a certain gene mutation. So the only way we can really test it is through your serum. And it can be really helpful to test it at that point in time too on cycle day 3. So I usually recommend just like compiling all those hormones during that time frame to get a good understanding. But there are other times that you can test certain hormones too. The important factor with that is just knowing when you're testing them and what the proper ratio and quantitative value would be at that time that you're testing it. Because otherwise it could get really confusing, and hormones they don't plateau, they fluctuate, they go up and down on a daily level, they go up and down on the cyclical level. But there's a lot of like research and understanding of what things should be at on cycle day 3.
Cool. All right. That makes sense. That's why you work with a practitioner. I don't feel the need to understand that because I feel like that's why you have a practitioner that will explain that
Yes.
to you. It's just important to get to a practitioner that you like and you trust and that explains things well to you. So you've mentioned healthy, like digestion and gastric health multiple times. What does that look like? How often should we be pooing and peeing and voiding? And if someone has a lot of flatulence, so they're farting all the time or burping all the time, are these things that are signs and symptoms of maybe some imbalance in your gut health?
Absolutely. Like GI symptoms that you experience are all a sign.
Mm,
We need to think of digestion as north to south. It all starts in the brain, basically, and then comes out through your bottom, right? So if we're experiencing things like a lot of flatulence or a lot of bloating or a lot of constipation or diarrhea, those are lower down south issues, but it all starts up north. So we need to be looking at digestive health again. That's why I said chew your food, be in a peaceful state when you're eating, because even if we're addressing something like constipation, diarrhea, or bloating or gas, we still need to work on the brain first. We need to make sure we're chewing properly, we're eating, because it goes in a north that you can bring in probiotics, but if you're not working on your digestive habits, those aren't going to have the same impact that you want them to have. You have to know that digestion is north to south and treating digestion is north to south as well. But yeah, so symptoms you may have, like I said, constipation, diarrhea, alternating constipation, diarrhea, those IBS type symptoms. You may have food allergies, food intolerances, food sensitivities. We're not supposed to be as sensitive as we are to everything necessarily. It's a big sign that there could be like intestinal permeability or inflammation of the GI tract that needs to be looked at and addressed. If you're not absorbing your food, if you're showing different nutrient deficiencies, if you're anemic, a lot of things can be related to, are you able to even process, break down, and metabolize that food into your system? Is it even getting anywhere? And also, yeah, do you have indigestion? Do you have heartburn? Do you have those upper GI based symptoms? All of it is connected. So any like type of symptom that you're experiencing in the GI is always warranted to be looked into further. Your body speaks to you through your symptoms. We need to be listening to them. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people be like, "Oh, I just have dealt with this my whole life." And it's your body's been crying for your whole life and it's been asking for support for this whole time. It's not normal. Just because something is common or common for you doesn't necessarily mean that it's normal, so to speak. Ideally, it's like we want to make sure that we are having a bowel movement at least one time a day. You could still have a bowel movement one time a day and still be constipated. So you want to look at the type of bowel movements you're having. The Bristol stool chart is a really good one. You can Google search it and you can see what's the quality of your poo, because it could be really dense and you're going to the bathroom just once, but you're still constipated. You know what I mean? So like 1 to 3 times a day is, I would say, pretty normal, but you want to be looking at the quality of it? Is it runny? Is it hard? Is it lumpy? Is it coming out in bits and pieces? Or is it like smooth like a sausage? Is it comfortable to get out? Are you pressing? Are you pushing to get it out? All of these things are important. But things like, yeah, being super bloated after your meals, or being, I could even get into like blood sugar if you're really tired after your meals. That is not a great sign either. If you're having heartburn before bed. Now, this is different with pregnancy because we have relaxin, and that definitely plays a role in your esophagus and other aspects, which, can be an issue for some, but may also be like a timely thing that goes away after pregnancy. But if you're like consistently having heartburn, acid reflux, you have GERD, you have some of these other issues that are constant, then that's a sign of a dysfunction too. I guess I could continue to go on, but does that answer your question as far as what symptoms to look out for and what is maybe normal versus not? You want to just be comfortable after your meals and satisfied.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was gonna say is it sounds like you just don't want any sort of like discomfort or interruption after meals or like any sort of actual real patterns. The pattern should just be like you feel great, you eat, you feel good, and what within 8, 12, 24 hours you should have a bowel movement. One thing that did come to mind is I know several people who tell me both pregnancy and outside of pregnancy that they don't poop but every couple days, or they don't poop but once a week. And so to hear you break down, like we should at least be having a bowel movement every 24 hours, I think is going to be really helpful for a lot of people. Is there anything that we can do to encourage that if we're not having a bowel movement every day, getting enough water, exercise, move your body?
Yeah, hydration is really important. Fiber can be helpful. I would start with looking at your diet and your hydration to begin,
Mm-hmm.
because it's, again, this goes back to the supplement conversation, but it's so easy to take a fiber supplement or take magnesium citrate or something that makes you poo, but it's not addressing the root. And the
Mm,
second you stop taking it, you're going to be constipated again.
yeah.
So it may get rid of the symptom, but it's not going to impact why exactly that's happening. And again, if you're just constipated, that's a down south issue. That means that you're likely not absorbing your food very well. There's probably some intestinal inflammation. There's probably other things that are impacting your body in other areas. Like, we need to be thinking outside of, I just can't go to the bathroom, but also how is this symptom is a sign of a larger issue.
Something
So
else. Yeah.
you may take magnesium and go to the bathroom, but that's not fixing the other issues that are having an impact on you earlier on in that north to south process.
Totally. To get us back to egg quality, follicle quality, I have a couple of things I'd like to ask about that may impact this, and you've explained what the connection between the two are. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Cool. How does stress and high cortisol impact our egg and follicle quality?
Ooh, that can go into numerous different ways, but when you're stressed and you have high cortisol, your cortisol is imbalanced. That, for one, can increase inflammation levels. Like, cortisol is an inflammatory hormone to a certain degree. So the more cortisol we have, the more inflammation can be circulating in our body, the more of an impact that can have on our cells, on our liver, and on our adrenals, and on our brain. So we tend to see, like, when we're in high stress situations, this can impact the brain's ability to produce those hormones like FSH properly, and it can stunt that communication from the hypothalamus pituitary to the ovaries, which can have a downward effect on your follicle development, but also too cortisol, pregnenolone, some of the deeper hormones that the adrenal works with are often precursors to our sex hormones. So we think about if there's going to be a cortisol dominant situation that happens. I don't like the term pregnenolone steal, which is one that you hear sometimes with progesterone. Oh, pregnenolone is this like precursor hormone that gets shuttled to cortisol instead of to progesterone production. It's not scientifically accurate. Again, I'm all about like proper terminologies of things, but your listeners may hear that, or they may see that in relation to stress and cortisol. If they're Google searching it, they'll see pregnenolone steal. Not always the most accurate, but the emphasis behind it is pretty pure too, where it's, yeah, if your body is stressed, it's going to prioritize cortisol production. It's not going to prioritize sex hormone production or progesterone production, because when the body is in a life or like a life-threatening situation, you're in fight or flight, it's not focusing on reproduction. It's trying to keep you alive. You know what I mean? And the body doesn't understand the difference between, oh, you just had a fight with your husband versus, oh, you're depleted in a certain nutrient because you're not eating very well, or your diet is lacking a certain quality. I can't really tell the difference between that, or are you being chased by a saber-toothed tiger and you need this adrenaline to get you moving? All stress is perceived as the same within the body. So if we have a lot of stress, the body is going to prioritize its stress reduction mechanisms, which kind of work with the adrenals and work with cortisol, which cortisol helps to reduce stress. That's one of cortisol's roles. But when cortisol is constantly being produced because stress just keeps happening and keeps happening, that's when it gets inflammatory and it starts to cause issues there. When it starts to cause issues there, it starts to cause inflammation and issues within the brain and the brain's communication to other endocrine organs. So then we start to see, you may have heard the term adrenal fatigue, which is also something that is not quite accurate because the adrenals don't necessarily get fatigued, but the communication between the brain and the adrenals don't work properly. So the proper term for this is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal dysfunction, or HPA dysfunction. And so that HPA connection, the brain to the adrenals, can get disrupted and that communication goes off. But when you start to see brain communication going off to one endocrine gland, it starts to go off to other endocrine glands too. So you may see brain connection to the thyroid going off. You may see brain connection to the ovaries going off. So we start to see like how does stress and inflammation and cortisol like impact our ovulation. It has this sort of like cascade effect where maybe in the beginning, not so much, but if you start to see this reoccurrent pattern, it's like, why is it that some people can handle their stress a lot better than others? It's like this stress bucket. We all have a certain load that we can take. And if we're not working on supporting the body nutritionally, as well as supporting the body emotionally and mentally, and working with the nervous system, then that stress bucket can overflow. And when it overflows, it starts to have an impact on other areas of the endocrine system, which can, of course, lead to your ovulatory quality and progesterone production and have an impact on your fertility in those ways.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. What about toxic load? You had mentioned toxic load a little bit before, and then before we started recording, you and I were talking about generational fertility. Talk to us a little bit about the toxic load that we have and how it is impacting our future generations, much like what you said before, because all of their eggs are really developed when they are in us.
Yeah. So toxic load, we're thinking about all the things that can impact our liver. We're thinking about all the things that can impact our metabolic processes. So yeah, toxins that we are exposed to is a big one. Looking at your environment, looking at what products you're using, looking at what foods you're consuming, what kind of water you're drinking, all of that plays a role, as well as like, there's some really crappy supplements out there that can also introduce different weird toxins and stuff to you too, medications. There's a lot of things that can contribute to that toxic load. But also going back to digestion, it's, if you have dysbiosis, you can have endotoxins. So you have toxins that are produced from the body itself. If there's metabolic toxins that are produced with energy production, and if your liver isn't able to work properly to clear those things because it's just overburdened by everything, then that's when things can begin to accumulate, cause inflammation, cause oxidative stress and damage. That can influence your eggs, it can influence your follicles, so on and so forth. But I think what we were talking about in regard to most of your eggs are 90% about mature before you're even born. Like, we need to be thinking about these processes up to a year before, ideally, I want to say up to a year before conception. I know that's not feasible for everyone. And I like to bring in this conversation of you do what you can, right? You do what you can. The more time you have to prepare, that's wonderful, but don't get hung up on, you want a baby, like I have to wait a year. If you can, then you can. And that's wonderful. But is something that is going to be approached differently for everybody. And that's a personal decision on how you approach things. But the longer you can wait, the longer you can support these processes, the more you can work on your digestive health, your liver health, your hormone production, making sure that you're sleeping well and all the things are working optimally, your ovulatory quality, which you said earlier, convert your brain from saying egg quality to follicle quality. I like to say ovulatory quality as like a whole, because it's all impacting ovulation in the end. And it's all impacting how the body is working. But yeah, like follicle quality, ovulatory quality, all kind of goes together. But when we're looking at like future generations, because let's be real, within the past 100, 200 years, less than that, fertility has become a rising issue. And at this point in time, the infertility market is like a multi-trillion-dollar market. And we're having people just constantly having issues with getting pregnant, staying pregnant, having successful IVF, having just issues in general with fertility in that regard. And we have to question why. Again, this goes back to fertility is a vital sign, so to speak. Even though like we talk about the menstruation's a vital sign, it definitely is. I like to think of ovulation as really the primary vital sign, and fertility is like all encompassing in a lot of that. But if we're declining in our fertility, that is a huge red flag. But we're also, it's not just stopping there. Like we have higher rates of heart disease, we have higher rates of strokes, we have higher rates of cancer. Everything's increasing in that regard. And we need to start paying attention to these things, because these are signs that something is not right in our diets and our society, in the air we're breathing and the water we're drinking. This is damage that has been occurring for the past couple hundred years. And so if we really want to start to see like a reversal of this, which is ideal, then we really need to be getting at, how are we influencing our bodies? What are we doing for us? And how might that impact our children? Because actually, there's a really good book called Deep Nutrition that I like to recommend for kind of this like preconception health topic, because it does go into how what you're eating can have an impact on your child, and then your child's health and development and their health and so on and so forth. It's been a long time since I read that book, but it's very interesting. But yeah, like basically this sort of epigenetics, it's like your genetics, it's your epigenetic all comes in, and your genes and your DNA and all of that kind of, it's a whole bowl of conversation in that regard, a whole different conversation there. But yeah, it's that year before, if you're working on your follicle health, if you're supporting your body's ability to conceive properly, you're providing as much nutrients, as much of the healthy ingredients that you need to be able to give the environment to your developing fetus, if she's female, to be able to produce high quality eggs in that gestational period, because certain DNA damage and issues can occur during that time frame. So like you are able to give her the best chance. And this is another reason why like a lot of medications are not recommended in pregnancy. DES, we want to think about the use of that. I think it was, gosh, I'm going to get my timelines mixed up, but like the 50s or the 60s or something that they were giving it to women, wound up causing reproductive issues in their children and their daughters later on. They weren't able to get pregnant. They had dysfunction. They had abnormalities in their reproductive development. Like what we do impacts our bodies and it impacts our children as well. So if we can think about these things a year ahead of time, like we're giving the best possible outcome to our children. And the more we can continue that process, the more hopefully results we see into the future, and we can try to stop some of this ongoing nature of fertility getting worse and worse with each and every generation. But we're talking about the field of epigenetics. We're talking about genetical nutrient delivery. You know what I'm saying? Like what we're giving to our children and how that's impacting them, and then how that's going to impact their offspring and so on and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to wrap up, is just that everything that we do now is not just for our bodies or our current baby, but your future generations. Think about it as your first gift to your grandchildren and your great grandchildren and just your whole lineage. If you're doing better than the generations before you, then you are improving your entire family lineage one birth at a time. And then you'll have your baby and you will teach them the new way of doing things, and their egg quality will improve just a little bit, and then they'll pass on that message, and slowly you can see that ripple effect. I love it so much. All right, I think my final question is where people can find you. So if you've said anything that sparked people's interest, or people are like, oh, I've been looking for a functional health specialist, or oh, I am in the process of trying to have a baby, or maybe even I've started IVF treatments and I want a functional health practitioner to work alongside my IVF treatments, where can people connect with you?
Yep. So you can find me personally on Instagram at Functional Hormone Health. And I'm pretty active on there with my posts and stories and everything. But you can find our community and the school that I run and operate, which is the International Association for Functional Hormone Health, at iafhh.com. And on there, we have practitioner training. So if you're somebody who is looking to educate yourself further, I know maybe there are some people who are birth workers or people who are nurses or in the medical field that may be interested in taking a deeper dive into some of the science behind everything that I'm talking about today. We do have a self-paced practitioner training that we train on all of this, and we certify our students to become functional hormone specialists. So that is definitely one area to look at. Or if you're somebody who is looking for support, we also have a practitioner directory on our website of all of our students who have graduated and learned from us, learned from me specifically, who know everything that I've said today because it's all in our curriculum. So they also are trained in functional testing and in working with your bio individual needs and getting you those more targeted strategic supplement recommendations and approaches and protocols. So you may be able to find somebody in your area or find someone online that you can work with through our practitioner directory. And if you want to learn a little bit more about our philosophy, about what we teach in regard to functional hormone health and how important hormones are for every process of the body, and how hormones influence the overall quality of our experience and our health as women and as females, then I invite you to watch our free training, Revolutionizing Hormones, which you can find at iafhh.com/training.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing all that. You guys, thanks for joining Ash and I today. I, for one, stand behind the message that your hormones are utterly important. The more that I have learned about my own hormones, the more I feel in tune with my body and the more in control of the decisions I made. And I want that for you. I want you to be able to understand what your body is doing, what we expect it to be doing, what it is communicating to you, and what your options are if we're seeing a little deficit between what your body is doing and what we expect it to be doing. So, you guys, I will see you in the next episode. Be sure to follow Ash on social media, and you can find me at Tranquility by HeHe on all platforms, and also at the.birth.lounge on Instagram. Until next time, head over to your app store and download the Birth Lounge app for evidence-based childbirth education and data-driven postpartum support delivered straight to your phone. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I truly do value this community, and I love hanging out with you. You deserve to have a birth that you love with a provider that values your autonomy and respects informed consent. It's an honor to be your go-to gal when it comes to preparing for your baby. If you found today's episode helpful, share it with a friend. Share it with someone who could use evidence-based information to help them have an informed and confident birth. I'd love to hear what you have to say and read your sweet words. By leaving us a review, you are helping other expectant mamas and their families find the podcast so that we can reduce birth trauma and improve maternity care in the U.S. one birth at a time. If you're interested in joining the Birth Lounge, go to thebirthlounge.com. If you want to connect with me on socials, you can find me at Tranquility by HeHe on all platforms. Until next time, stay educated, stay supported, stay confident. Bye!